When I saw my husband standing in the doorway, holding that small brown envelope in his hand, my breath caught, not because I feared he might open it, but because I already knew what was inside. A flash drive. The same one I had hidden, the same one I'd pretended didn't exist. He didn't say a word, he just turned it over in his fingers, studying the label-less plastic like it could whisper secrets on its own. My mouth went dry. I wanted to snatch it away, to laugh, to claim it was junk mail, but his eyes stayed locked on mine, calm in that unnerving way, and my stomach clenched. He walked to the table, laid the envelope down with a carefulness that felt deliberate, and for a second I thought he might leave it there forever. But then he tapped it once, like a judge tapping a gavel, and the sound echoed in my head. The kitchen felt too small, the walls too close. I could hear my pulse in my ears. He didn't ask me what it was. He didn't have to. My hands were trembling as I reached for a mug, pretending to make tea, like the routine could save me. But his silence was a mirror, and in it, I saw everything I'd done. Every choice, every moment I thought I could tuck away in the dark corners of my memory. 3 months ago, I made a mistake, the kind of mistake that doesn't just bruise, it rearranges the bones of your life. And now it was standing on my kitchen table in the shape of a flash drive. Before I tell you how everything unraveled, before I share the story of the nights I thought were mine alone, I need to take you back to the first moment when the lines I thought I'd drawn for myself began to blur, when an innocent decision opened a door I never should have walked through. I didn't wake up one morning planning to change my life. That's the thing no one tells you about crossing lines, you don't do it with fanfare or intention. You do it with small, almost invisible steps. And when you finally look back, you can't see where the safe ground ended. For me, it started on an ordinary Tuesday. I was standing in the kitchen, the same faded tiles under my feet, the same fridge humming in the background, when the phone rang. It was my oldest friend. Her voice was bright, too bright, the way it always was when she was asking for a favor she'd already decided I would say yes to. Her son, she explained, had been offered a temporary position in the city. He needed a place to stay, just for a few weeks, maybe a month. A hotel was too expensive, and her own apartment was too small. Could he stay with us? I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was noon, and the house was silent. My husband was at work, like always. He'd left before sunrise, leaving his empty coffee cup in the sink and a perfunctory kiss on my cheek that hadn't felt like anything for a long time. Of course, I heard myself say, and even as the words left my mouth, I felt a faint flutter in my chest. It wasn't excitement, not really. It was something lighter and stranger, like being seen after a long time of feeling invisible. I spent the afternoon preparing the guest room. The room hadn't been used in years, not since my husband's cousin had stayed over one Christmas. Dust clung to the dresser, the curtains sagged, and the bedspread smelled faintly of old fabric softener. I opened the windows, stripped the sheets, and found myself fussing in ways I hadn't fussed in years, straightening books on the shelf, rearranging pillows, smoothing out creases until the fabric lay perfectly flat. By the time I heard the car pull into the driveway, the sun had dipped low enough to cast the kitchen in that warm orange glow that makes everything look softer than it is. He walked in carrying one suitcase and a box of books. He was polite, careful with his words, and he smiled in that unguarded way young people still smile before life teaches them not to. "It's really kind of you," he said, setting his things down by the door. I brushed it off, told him it was nothing, that we were happy to have him. But as I led him to the guest room, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. My hair was pinned neatly, my blouse buttoned, but for the first time in months, I had added a pair of earrings, a small detail I hadn't thought much about until I saw them sparkle in the dim light. My husband arrived home late, as usual, shoulders hunched, laptop bag slung over one arm. He gave our guest a quick handshake, exchanged the polite words people do when they're too tired for more, then disappeared into the shower. He didn't notice the way I'd changed the table setting for dinner. He didn't notice the way I'd ironed my shirt. He didn't notice me. That night, after they both went to bed, I wandered through the house, turning off lights. The guest room door was closed, a strip of light at the bottom, a shadow moving softly behind it. For a moment, I thought about knocking, about saying something, I didn't know. But I didn't. Instead, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring out at the dark yard. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, a reminder that time moves even when you stand still. I washed a single glass, dried it slowly, and tried not to think about why my hands were shaking. Lying in bed next to my husband, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the unfamiliar quiet of someone else's presence in the house. It wasn't that anything happened. Nothing happened. But it felt like something had shifted, a tiny tilt in the ground beneath me. It was almost imperceptible, the way these things always are at first. Just a favor for a friend. Just a guest in the house. Just another night in a marriage that had become more habit than heat. But later, when I would try to trace back how it all began, I would think of that Tuesday. The phone call. The dusted dresser. The way I smoothed the bedspread until there wasn't a wrinkle left, like preparing for someone to see me again. The first night it happened, I wasn't expecting to see anyone awake. The house had been still for hours, the kind of stillness that settles deep, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I had been lying in bed, eyes fixed on the dark outline of the ceiling fan, when the restlessness became too sharp to ignore. My husband was asleep beside me, his breathing slow, heavy, the sound of someone lost in another world. I slipped out of bed, careful not to make the mattress creak, and padded down the hallway. The kitchen light was off when I arrived, but there was a dim glow, one of the under-cabinet lights I'd forgotten even existed. And there he was. Sitting at the table, elbows propped on the wood, a mug cradled in his hands. His hair was a little disheveled, like he'd been tossing in bed too. I froze in the doorway. He looked up, startled but smiling faintly, a small, tired curve of his lips that felt almost apologetic. "I couldn't sleep," he said softly, voice rough from the hour. I nodded, moving toward the counter. "Me neither." The air between us felt different from the air upstairs, as though the kitchen existed in its own pocket of time. I poured myself some water, the trickle loud in the silence, and leaned against the counter. The clock on the wall glowed faintly, 1:43. A strangely precise hour, one that would come to mean something later, but right then it was just an odd number glowing in the dark. We made small talk at first. Harmless words about the weather, the city, the adjustment to a new place. His voice was quiet, almost cautious, like he didn't want to disturb the quiet more than he already had. But then, somewhere in the lull of conversation, something shifted. It wasn't anything either of us said. It was in the way he looked at me, not a bold, searching stare, but an unguarded one. Like he was simply seeing me, and that felt rare. My hand brushed against the edge of the table as I sat down across from him. The wood felt cold under my palm, grounding, and yet my heart was beating too quickly for such an ordinary moment. He told me about his first day in the city, about the way the streets felt overwhelming, the way his temporary job already felt heavier than he'd imagined. He laughed once, a low, quick laugh at himself for getting lost on the way back from the store. I found myself telling him things I hadn't planned to share, the kind of small confessions that slip out in the early hours of the morning. How I used to love staying up late when I was younger. How I sometimes sat in this same kitchen at night, long before he arrived, just to remember what silence sounded like. The conversation ebbed, and the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full. Too full, maybe. Our eyes met, briefly, and then held for a fraction longer than they should have. There are moments you don't plan, moments that feel like they're happening to someone else, like you're watching a version of yourself from the outside. That's how it felt when I leaned slightly closer, not much, just enough that the space between us seemed to shrink on its own. And then, we kissed, It wasn't drawn out. It wasn't elaborate. It was a single, brief connection, a moment of closeness that felt almost accidental, though I knew better. When it ended, we both pulled back at once, as if we'd each remembered where we were, who we were. The chair legs scraped faintly on the tile as I stood up, the sound too loud in the quiet kitchen. I should get back to bed, I said, but my voice didn't sound like mine. He just nodded, eyes cast down at the mug in his hands. I walked back up the stairs as if the steps were thinner than air, each one carrying me further from that moment and yet binding me tighter to it. Lying back down beside my husband, the sheets felt different, rougher, heavier. I stared into the dark, the outline of his back against the dim light spilling from under the door, and my heartbeat refused to slow. I didn't tell myself it was nothing. I knew it wasn't. The next morning, everything in the house looked the same, but it all felt slightly off, like a picture frame nudged half an inch crooked. I made breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, coffee, just as I always did. My husband sat at the table, scrolling through his phone, barely speaking except to say he'd be late tonight. Across from him, the guest offered a polite thank you, eyes down on his plate, but there was a brief flicker when our gazes crossed, the faintest acknowledgement of the night before. We didn't speak of it. Of course we didn't. But every ordinary movement, passing him the butter, setting down a glass, felt laden with something unspoken, a quiet weight I wasn't ready to name. And all day, as I folded laundry, as I answered emails, as I stood in the garden pretending to care about the weeds creeping up between the paving stones, that kiss stayed with me. It shouldn't have mattered. It was nothing more than a breath, a brush, a moment. But it did matter. It mattered because it had been so long since someone had looked at me like that. It mattered because, in that one quiet second, I hadn't felt invisible. And because now, no matter how much I told myself to stop thinking about it, I couldn't. The days that followed passed in a strange rhythm, ordinary on the surface yet humming with something underneath I couldn't quite name. I woke up when my husband's alarm went off, made the same breakfast, folded the same laundry, but there was a new tension, a hum that threaded through every movement. It wasn't loud, it didn't demand to be noticed, but I felt it in the way my hands lingered on a cup when I passed it across the table, in the way I avoided looking too long in one direction. He was careful too. Or maybe I only imagined he was. At breakfast, he spoke less than he had on the first day, though he'd never been overly talkative to begin with. His politeness remained, the same soft thank you when I poured him coffee, the same measured smile when he helped clear dishes, but there was an added caution in the way he moved, like we were both circling around the same unspoken thing. That night, I told myself I would sleep. That I would stay in bed. That what had happened was a one-time mistake, already fading. But my body betrayed me. I woke again, without an alarm, my eyes flicking open to the glowing numbers on the clock. 1:30. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself to stay under the covers. But the stillness felt heavy, pressing against my chest, and before I knew it, I was on my feet, my steps slow and deliberate on the stairs. The kitchen light was off, but there was that same faint glow, like the room was waiting. He was there again, leaning against the counter this time, a glass of water in his hand. We spoke briefly about sleep, about the hum of the refrigerator, about nothing at all, but conversation wasn't really the point. There was a strange comfort in simply standing there, in sharing that quiet hour. The clock on the wall glowed again, 1:43. The second night turned into a third. Each time, I thought about stopping. I thought about how it might look, if someone were to see us sitting across from each other in that dim kitchen. But the pull was stronger than the arguments I made to myself in bed. By the fourth night, it wasn't a coincidence. We both knew. I'd wake up and glance at the clock, and by the time I reached the bottom of the stairs, I'd find him already there, waiting. We didn't talk about the kiss. We didn't talk about why we kept ending up in the same place at the same time. Instead, we spoke about his new job, his mother, his favorite books, the little frustrations of learning a new city. And I listened. Really listened. More than I had in years. I started to notice the smallest things. The way he wrapped his hands around a mug to warm them. The way his hair stuck up in uneven tufts when he hadn't smoothed it down. The way he sometimes laughed under his breath, quietly, at something only he found funny. And he noticed things too, I think. One evening, he pointed out that I always touched the edge of the countertop when I stood near it, running my fingers along the smooth wood without realizing. The mornings were harder. Sitting at the table with my husband there, reading his emails between bites of toast, I felt split in two. Nothing had happened again, nothing more than words and silence, but those nights had taken on a shape I couldn't flatten. One morning, I saw it in the smallest moment. I was pouring juice, and his glass brushed my hand just slightly as he reached for it. My husband didn't look up from his phone, didn't see the way I pulled back too quickly, heat rushing to my face. By then, I had started to wake even earlier, lying in bed wide-eyed, waiting for the clock to tell me it was time to move. But with that waiting came something else, an unease that grew stronger each night. It started with small things. A neighbor's dog barked suddenly one night, sharp and insistent, as if it had seen movement outside. I glanced toward the window and saw only darkness, but the sound left me unsettled, like we weren't as hidden as we thought. Another night, as I walked to the kitchen, I thought I heard a creak from the guest room my husband and I never used, the one next to the stairs. I froze on the landing, listening, but the sound didn't come again. It was probably nothing. It was always probably nothing. But those small, ordinary sounds began to feel like warnings, like the house itself was holding its breath. I told myself I should stop going downstairs. That this was already too much, too strange. But stopping would have meant lying awake alone, feeling the pull and refusing it. And the truth was, I didn't want to refuse it. Those quiet moments in the kitchen, the soft sound of a spoon clinking against a mug, the way the words came slower, less guarded in the early hours, those things had become something I couldn't easily step away from. One night, after we'd been talking for an hour, he mentioned something about the city lights, how they made him feel both small and infinite at the same time. I looked at him then, and for a second, I forgot about everything else, the marriage, the walls, the weight of what I was doing. I felt visible. It had been so long since I felt that way that I barely recognized the sensation. And yet, beneath that warmth, there was fear too. Fear that these nights weren't as harmless as I tried to tell myself. Fear that each step down the stairs was carrying me further away from the version of myself I thought I knew. By the end of the week, the clock wasn't just a clock anymore. It was a signal. Each time I saw those numbers glowing in the dark, 1:30, 1:35, 1:43, I felt the same pull in my chest, the same quiet, inevitable movement toward the kitchen. I told myself it was nothing. That nothing had really happened. That I was still in control. But deep down, I knew better. The week that followed blurred into something strange and weightless, the kind of days where you do all the same things but somehow feel like you're watching yourself from a few steps away. I kept the routines, the laundry, the meals, the grocery lists, yet every ordinary movement seemed to echo, like the sound of dishes clinking in the sink was louder than it should have been, like the house itself had started to notice the things I was trying not to. I told myself, more than once, that I would stop. That the next night I would stay in bed. That I wouldn't glance at the clock, wouldn't let my feet hit the floor, wouldn't creep down those stairs again. And for most of the day, I almost believed myself. But the moment evening settled in and the house grew quiet, that promise began to feel flimsy. By the fourth or fifth night, I had given up pretending I didn't know what I was doing. I woke up before the clock even hit 1:30, lying in the dark with my eyes open, listening to my husband's even breathing beside me. I would stare at the ceiling and bargain with myself, 5 more minutes, 10. And then, always, I'd slip from bed, the sheets barely rustling as I eased away. Downstairs, the kitchen became its own kind of world. Dim light, 2 mugs, the faint hum of the refrigerator, those were constants. He was there again, always there, sitting quietly like he had known I'd come. We didn't talk about the fact that it had become a pattern. Maybe we didn't want to break the spell by naming it. During the day, I felt the edges of it creeping into everything. My husband would come home, drop his keys into the dish by the door, and I would find myself studying his face for the smallest sign that he knew. He didn't. Or, if he did, he hid it well. He was tired in the way he'd been tired for years, his attention split between his work and the television, his plate and his phone. I caught myself, too, doing little things I hadn't in years. I ironed a blouse that didn't need ironing. I painted my nails, pale and simple, but enough that the color caught my eye when I reached for a glass. I told myself these were for me, that it was harmless to care again. But I couldn't quite ignore the way my chest tightened when I saw him notice, even if he didn't say a word. Then came the day I left the house, determined to shake the heaviness. I drove into the city under the excuse of needing groceries, though my list was short and nothing urgent. The streets felt bigger than usual, the shop windows too bright. I wandered into a store I hadn't been to in years, ran my fingers over stacks of books, held a bottle of wine in my hand for longer than necessary. It wasn't that I wanted the wine. It was that the shape of the bottle reminded me of something, of sitting across from him at the table, of the sound of a cork twisting. By the time I returned, the house felt different. My husband had beaten me home for once, his car already in the driveway. He was in the living room, his jacket draped over a chair. "Out for long?" he asked casually, his voice even, but something in me stuttered at the question. "Just groceries," I said, holding up the bag as proof, though the items inside felt suddenly flimsy. He nodded, didn't press, and yet the brief exchange left me off balance, like he might have been asking more than I heard. That evening, as I sorted the mail, I found the envelope. It was small, too small for anything significant, and unmarked except for my name in block letters. I tore it open without thinking, expecting a coupon or a thank you card, but what fell into my hand wasn't paper. It was a flash drive, plain, black, unassuming. I stared at it for a long moment, my thumb running over its smooth surface. No label. No note. Just plastic and metal and the weight of possibility. I didn't plug it in. I couldn't explain why, but the thought of sliding it into my laptop felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, like the moment before a door you don't want to open clicks wide. Instead, I slid it into the drawer under the counter and shut it with a little too much force, as if the act of hiding it there would make it irrelevant. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next night, I found myself glancing toward that drawer as I passed it on my way to the kitchen. The flash drive might as well have been glowing. Even as I sat down at the table, even as I stirred a spoon through my tea, I felt it there, humming in the dark like a secret waiting to be uncovered. I told myself I'd throw it away. I told myself I'd toss it into the trash with the coffee grounds and the eggshells and never think of it again. But I didn't. Instead, I left it in the drawer and kept walking downstairs at night, as though nothing had shifted. But something had. The silence we shared was still there, warm and fragile, but now it felt like it was being watched, like even the walls might be holding a breath. One evening, as I stood by the sink, I thought I saw a flicker of light outside the window, maybe a passing car, maybe nothing. But my chest tightened, and for the first time, I wondered what we looked like from outside. The kitchen, once a quiet refuge, suddenly felt like it had edges that cut sharper than before. And yet, when the clock turned past 1:30, I still found myself there, the weight of the hidden flash drive pressing against my thoughts, though my fingers didn't reach for it. I didn't open it. I didn't even move it. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't just a thing in a drawer. It was a line waiting to be crossed. By the time the next week unfolded, the nights no longer felt like accidents, they had hardened into something deliberate, though we still never spoke about it. I would move through the day like any other wife in any other house, making meals, sweeping crumbs from the counter, answering texts from my friend as though nothing unusual was happening under her nose. But the hours after midnight had taken on a shape, and I had stopped pretending not to see it. Every evening, I'd tell myself to sleep through. I'd press my eyes closed, count the slow breaths of my husband beside me, force my mind onto mundane things, shopping lists, laundry cycles, the phone call I needed to return. But inevitably, the silence grew too thick. The air too heavy. And at some point, without conscious decision, I'd find myself pushing back the covers and stepping out of bed. The stairs had started to creak louder, or maybe I was only more aware of them. Each step felt like it carried its own echo, like the house itself was keeping a tally. And every night, he was there. Some nights, he sat at the table, staring into the steam rising from a mug of tea. Other nights, he leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely, as if he'd been waiting but didn't want to look like he had been. It didn't matter how I told myself not to go, when I arrived, I always felt that strange calm mix with a sharp awareness, like touching a glass that's cool and warm at the same time. The conversations deepened, but not in the way you might expect. There was no big confession, no spilling of secrets. Instead, there were smaller things, breadcrumbs of lives we never intended to share. He told me about the book his mother had given him before he left for the city, one he hadn't opened yet because it felt too heavy with meaning. I told him about the box of old photographs I kept in the closet, photos of myself before I had gray in my hair, before I stopped wearing red lipstick for no reason at all. We never named the kiss. It sat between us like a ghost, present but unacknowledged. And then one night, it happened again. I don't even know what the spark was. A quiet joke, maybe, or the way our hands brushed on the counter as I reached for the kettle. The air seemed to shift, like a current had passed through the room, and before I could think, we kissed. Just those two words. Just that moment. It was different from the first. The first had been accidental, almost startled. This one was softer but undeniable, a choice made without speaking. When it ended, we both stepped back, the quiet returning like a tide rolling in. He turned slightly, fiddling with the handle of his mug, and I busied my hands with the teapot, pouring water though neither of us needed more. I told myself I shouldn't have done it, and yet the guilt wasn't clean, it was muddled with something else, something almost like relief. The next morning, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror while brushing my teeth. My face was the same. The same lines, the same tired eyes. And yet there was something about the way I held myself that felt subtly altered, like my posture had borrowed a kind of lightness it hadn't carried in years. I found myself cooking differently that day, adding herbs to the soup that I hadn't bothered with before, arranging slices of bread more neatly on the plate. When my husband came into the kitchen, he paused for a second, looked at the table, then at me. "You've been busy," he said, his tone neutral. "Just keeping things tidy," I replied, wiping my hands on a towel, though my pulse was ticking a little too fast in my throat. He nodded and sat down, scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the quiet storm swirling just outside his awareness. But there were moments when I felt the tension pressing in more sharply. That evening, as I stood at the window rinsing dishes, I noticed the tiny red light of the security camera in the corner of the yard, a light I'd seen 100 times but never thought much about. This time, it felt like it was staring back at me. Was it silly? Probably. Nothing had happened in view of it. But the sight of that blinking light sent a prickle up my spine, and for the first time, I wondered how fragile the illusion of privacy really was. I tried to shake it off. I moved through the motions, washing the plates, drying them, stacking them in the cabinet, but the thought clung like static. The nights continued. We kissed again, but only those two words matter. We kissed, and we didn't explain it, didn't dissect it, didn't let it turn into more than what it was in that moment. But the weight of those nights began to change me in ways I couldn't hide, even from myself. I started noticing color again. I caught myself standing in front of my wardrobe longer than usual, not for him, not even consciously, but because suddenly I cared about which sweater I chose. I caught myself looking forward to the smallest things, the way he would rest his hand on the edge of the table, the way the steam curled up from the mugs. And I caught myself being gentler with my husband, too. Making his coffee just the way he liked it, asking about his meetings even when I already knew he'd answer with half a sentence. It wasn't guilt exactly, it was some blend of guilt and gratitude and confusion. But always, beneath all that, there was the quiet hum of those nights. The hum of that second kiss, heavier than the first. The hum of knowing I was walking a line I couldn't fully step back from. And the hum of the tiniest thought that scared me more than any of it. What if I didn't want to? The quiet in the house shifted the morning my husband told me he'd be away for a few days. He said it casually, over coffee, like it was any other piece of news. They want me on site for the project, he explained, tapping his thumb against his mug. I'll leave tomorrow, probably back by the weekend. I nodded, the way any wife would nod at ordinary logistics, but something inside me shifted. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't fear. It was something heavier and more complicated than either of those things, a sense of space opening where none had been before. The day he left, the house felt different from the moment the door clicked shut behind him. The silence wasn't the same silence I'd lived with for years. This silence had a weight to it, a thickness. There was no cough from the other room, no footsteps upstairs, no sound of him setting his keys in the dish by the door. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the house settling in the late afternoon light. I moved through my chores, but each one felt magnified. The vacuum seemed too loud. The clatter of plates in the sink seemed to echo. Even the ticking of the clock felt closer somehow, like the house was leaning in to listen. By evening, I couldn't ignore the drawer any longer. The flash drive was still there, exactly where I had left it. I hadn't told anyone about it, not my husband, not my friend. It had sat in that drawer for days, humming silently at the back of my mind like an unanswered question. I pulled it out and turned it in my hands. It was nothing but plastic and metal, weightless in the palm of my hand. And yet, it felt impossibly heavy. I didn't plug it in. I thought about sitting down at the kitchen table, sliding it into my laptop, seeing whatever it wanted to show me. But my chest tightened at the thought. I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. Instead, I put it back, gently this time, closing the drawer softly, like I was tucking away something alive. That night, the house felt more still than ever. When I came downstairs, I wasn't surprised to see him already there. He didn't look startled when I entered, he simply lifted his eyes from his mug, like he had known all along I'd come. We talked, but the words were softer, slower. There was no need to fill every silence. Somewhere in that quiet, I noticed how the space between us had changed. Not just since that first kiss, not just since the second, it was the accumulation of all the nights, of every shared glance and every shared silence. I poured tea, the steam rising in soft curls, and caught myself brushing my fingers over the rim of the mug before handing it to him. Small, unconscious gestures had started to feel like their own kind of language. And yet, under all that, there was a gnawing awareness, the flash drive, the drawer, the feeling of being watched by things I couldn't name. The next day, a second envelope arrived. It was the same size as the first, just as unmarked, just as plain. I slid my finger under the seal, the paper tearing softly, and out fell another flash drive. This one had a note. Just 3 words, scrawled in thick black ink, "You should see." I stood there holding the note, the words smudging faintly under my thumb, and felt a tremor run through me. Someone had sent this. Someone wanted me to see something. But I didn't plug that one in either. I told myself it could be junk, a mistake, something meaningless. But the thought rang hollow. That night, I stood at the kitchen counter longer than usual, the second flash drive sitting on the wood in front of me. He glanced at it once, then at me, but didn't ask. Neither of us touched it. We drank tea again, and the conversation wandered into quieter places, memories of childhood summers, stray thoughts about the sound of rain on different rooftops. But the flash drive stayed on the counter, silent and undeniable, as if it were listening. I found myself staring at the window, at the faint reflection of the two of us sitting there. For the first time, I thought about how fragile this all was. Not just what we were doing, not just the late-night conversations, not just the 2 kisses that still lingered between us. But the structure of it all. How quickly something small could unravel everything. I didn't open the flash drive that night. I didn't throw it away either. I left it sitting there on the counter when I went back upstairs, the weight of it still pressing against me even after I climbed back into bed. As I lay in the dark, I thought about the quiet of the house, the way it seemed to be holding all of this inside its walls. And I thought about how much harder it was becoming to tell myself that nothing had really happened. Because something had. Something had, and now it was waiting for me to decide what came next. The night my husband's car disappeared down the driveway for his trip, the quiet that followed felt heavier than I imagined it would. I watched the taillights fade through the front window, his casual wave barely visible in the dark, and for a long time I stood there in the entryway, my hand resting on the doorframe, as though holding it would anchor me to something solid. The house seemed larger without him, though nothing had changed in its shape or size. Every creak felt sharper, every corner more open. I moved through the evening like I always did, wiping the counters, sorting the mail, folding a load of towels, but the silence seemed to swallow each sound before it could fade. By the time the clock read past midnight, the air in the house felt different. I didn't even pretend to resist this time. I didn't tell myself to stay in bed, didn't lie there staring at the ceiling with excuses stacking in my head. I simply rose, the sheets falling quietly behind me, and walked down the stairs. He was already there. There was no surprise in his face when I stepped into the kitchen. He didn't even look startled, just met my eyes with a steadiness that felt both calm and charged, like neither of us had to ask why we were awake. The kettle was on, a low hum filling the room, and the soft light from the under-cabinet bulbs cast everything in that half-shadow that had become so familiar. We didn't talk much. There wasn't a need to. I don't know what broke the silence first. Maybe it was the way his hand brushed the edge of the table as he moved closer, maybe it was the way my breath caught slightly when I realized I hadn't stepped back. Maybe it was simply that all the nights leading here had built something neither of us could keep standing still any longer. There was no discussion, no naming of it, no deliberate plan. It happened the way a dam breaks, not suddenly, but from pressure that's been building for longer than anyone admits. We spent the night together. Those 4 words are enough. They have to be. Because describing every detail isn't the point. The point is the weight of the choice, the reality that once it was made, there was no undoing it. When morning came, the light was different. I woke first, the soft spill of dawn creeping across the kitchen floor, and for a moment I didn't move. I just sat there, my hands resting on the cool surface of the table, staring at nothing, listening to the house breathe around me. When I finally caught my reflection in the darkened oven door, I almost didn't recognize myself. There was a looseness in my shoulders I hadn't seen in years, an unfamiliar softness around my mouth. But alongside that, there was a sharpness. Guilt, yes. That sharp little cut in the chest that tells you you've crossed a line you can't step back over. But something else too, a hollow awareness that this couldn't be put neatly back into a drawer like a sweater you regret buying. I heard footsteps behind me and felt my body tense without meaning to. When I turned, it wasn't my husband, of course, it couldn't be, but the thought still flickered through me like a warning. I made coffee after that, hands steady but too careful, as though I could brew normalcy into the air. The day moved oddly. Time bent around the edges, moments stretching too long or snapping short. I swept the kitchen floor twice, though it didn't need it. I rearranged the fruit bowl. I opened the mail and read the same letter 3 times without taking in a word. And every time I passed the counter, I saw the flash drives. I hadn't moved them. The first was still in the drawer, the second on the counter, its pale note folded neatly beneath it. They were small things, almost weightless, but their presence filled the room like a third voice. By evening, another envelope arrived. I found it in the mailbox, sitting under a flyer for a garden sale, plain as all the others. I carried it into the kitchen and set it down, but I didn't open it. I didn't have to. I already knew it would hold another flash drive. The sight of the unopened envelope sitting next to the others made something inside me clench. When the house grew dark again, I found myself standing in front of the sink, my hands pressed flat to the counter, staring out at the yard through the window. There was no blinking light from the security camera this time, no stray flicker from a passing car, but I felt the same prickle along my spine anyway. The night before had already rewritten something in me. I couldn't call it back. I couldn't tuck it away and pretend it hadn't happened. We spent the night together. The words kept circling, quiet but insistent, like a whisper I couldn't turn off. And as the clock crept toward midnight again, I realized there wasn't really a choice left. The line I'd thought I was tiptoeing along wasn't a line anymore. It was gone. And now, there was only the open space on the other side. The next morning I woke before the sun had fully risen, though I hadn't really slept. The light was thin, that pale gray that slips into the room before the world is awake. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, my fingers gripping the sheet, staring at the floor like the answer to everything might be hidden in the grain of the wood. When I finally stood, the air in the house felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. My husband was still gone, his side of the bed empty and cool, but the absence didn't feel freeing. It felt exposed, like every breath I took might leave a mark. Downstairs, the kitchen told its own story. The mugs from the night before still sat on the counter, the faint ring of tea left behind in one of them. I washed them quickly, almost too quickly, as if erasing them might erase what had happened. But of course, it didn't. Every movement that day carried weight. I cooked breakfast but barely ate any of it. I watered the plants in the living room, staring too long at the way the soil darkened under the stream, like maybe if I focused hard enough on something simple, it would drown out the noise in my head. But there was no drowning it out. By the time the mail arrived, my hands were trembling. I opened the front door, and there it was, a 4th envelope. Just like the others, plain, unmarked, sitting in the box like it belonged there. I stood in the doorway for a moment, holding it in my hand, feeling the paper bend under my fingers. I didn't open it. I couldn't. The second and third flash drives were still sitting on the counter. The first was still buried in the drawer. The unopened envelope joined the pile, and the sight of them all together felt like a weight pressing against my chest. That evening, when the sky turned dark, he found me standing in the kitchen staring at them. I hadn't meant to stand there that long, hadn't meant to leave them all out like evidence, but there they were, 3 small objects that somehow managed to feel larger than the entire house. He glanced at them, then at me. His mouth opened slightly, like he might ask, but he didn't. He didn't have to. I turned away, busying my hands with the kettle, even though neither of us had asked for tea yet. The sound of the water filling the pot was too loud in the quiet room. We sat at the table later, the flash drives between us on the counter like another person in the room. I didn't touch them. I didn't even look at them directly. But I could feel their presence, the way a draft seeps under a closed door. You can't see it, but you know it's there. That night, I couldn't find words easily. He didn't, either. The silences were longer, the space between them heavier. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of the earlier nights, it was something else, something that felt like waiting. At one point, I thought about telling him everything. Not just about the flash drives. Not just about the envelope. Everything. I even opened my mouth, my fingers tightening around the edge of the table, but the words never came. Instead, I busied myself again, standing to rinse the mugs, moving too quickly, like movement itself could disguise the stillness underneath. Later, after he'd gone to his room, I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the flash drives. I pulled open the drawer and took out the first one. I set it next to the others. 4 of them now, lined up like tiny sentinels. I reached for my laptop. My hand hovered above the lid, fingers grazing the smooth plastic. I could open it. I could slide one in, see whatever had been sent, whatever was waiting. But I didn't. I shut the drawer, leaving the laptop unopened, the flash drive still on the counter. And for the first time, the house didn't feel quiet. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the moment I finally did what I'd been avoiding. When I went upstairs, the sound of my own footsteps on the stairs felt too loud, like they were announcing every thought I was trying to keep contained. Lying in bed later, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the weight of those 4 small objects downstairs. They didn't make a sound, but I could feel them anyway, like a pulse beneath the floorboards. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe the silence wasn't just in my head anymore. Maybe the silence belonged to the whole house. Maybe the house itself was waiting too. The day my husband returned, the entire house seemed to brace itself. I woke before dawn, as if my body knew he'd be back before my mind had caught up. The morning light felt brittle, sharp through the curtains, every corner of the house standing at attention. I moved through my routines with mechanical precision, folding towels, rinsing mugs, wiping the counters that were already clean. My hands kept busy, but my head was crowded. The 4 flash drives sat in a neat line on the counter, a silent row of truths I still hadn't touched. I didn't move them. I didn't hide them. I simply let them sit there, daring me to do something I still couldn't. When I heard his car in the driveway, my heart jumped, then settled into a low, steady pound. I stood by the sink as he came in, his keys clinking into the dish by the door, the sound as familiar as breathing. He didn't notice me right away. He stood in the entryway, glancing around, and I wondered if the house felt different to him too, or if that was just my imagination, stretching to fit my own unease. When he finally looked at me, his expression was the same one I had seen 1,000 times before after these trips, tired, distracted, relieved to be home. But something in me tightened all the same. I poured him coffee, just as I always did, and asked how the trip had been. He answered in brief sentences about meetings, about traffic, about nothing at all. It was ordinary conversation, words we could have spoken on any day of any year. And yet, every syllable felt layered with something I couldn't name. Throughout the day, I kept noticing his silences. They weren't heavy or sharp, they were just there, in the spaces between the words, in the way his gaze would sometimes linger a little too long. He didn't look suspicious, exactly. But he looked present, aware, like he was paying closer attention than usual. When he sat at the kitchen table that afternoon, his fingers brushed against the flash drives on the counter. He didn't say anything about them. He didn't even look at me. He just tapped one once with his thumb, a soft, absent gesture, and left it there. I felt my throat tighten. He didn't plug one in. He didn't ask where they'd come from. But that single tap felt louder than words. The rest of the day was slow, too slow. My friend called in the evening. Her voice came bright through the phone, asking casually about her son, about how things were going, about how grateful she was. "I owe you for this," she said lightly, laughing. I smiled, even though she couldn't see me, and told her he had been no trouble at all. My voice sounded steady, but inside, it felt like I was holding my breath. When I hung up, I found my husband standing in the doorway. He didn't ask who it was, he didn't need to. He just nodded, the gesture small, and walked past me to set his bag down. The evening passed in fragments. I made dinner. He ate quietly. Our guest helped clear the table, his movements as careful as ever, but I couldn't meet his eyes. Not with my husband just a few steps away, not with those 4 flash drives still sitting in their neat row. Later, when the dishes were done and the lights were low, I found myself staring at the kitchen clock, listening to the sound of my husband's footsteps upstairs. Each creak of the floorboards felt sharper, as if every step was searching for something hidden. The weight of everything pressed in harder that night. I thought about the nights before, the quiet kitchen, the tea, the soft moments I had let happen. I thought about how I had convinced myself that silence meant safety, that as long as nothing was named, nothing could spill out. But now, silence felt dangerous. Because silence could hold anything. When my husband came back into the kitchen, he didn't look angry. He didn't look suspicious. He looked calm. Too calm. He picked up one of the flash drives, turned it over in his hand, and set it back down. No words. Just that small act, that tiny movement, and I felt my breath catch. Because calm wasn't always comfort. Sometimes calm was just the surface of something else. And I couldn't tell if that something else was already rising, or if it was still waiting. The next day felt like walking across thin ice, each step too careful, every sound carrying farther than it should have. My husband moved through the house with a steady calm, the kind that looked ordinary from the outside but felt deliberate when you were standing too close to it. He wasn't distant, but he wasn't warm either. He simply was present in every room he entered, his silence measured, his glances just long enough to remind me that he saw everything I was doing. I woke that morning feeling like I hadn't slept at all. The sunlight came in pale and flat, touching the corners of the room without softening anything. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than I meant to, toothbrush in hand, staring at my own reflection. The face staring back was familiar, yet altered, the same lines, the same tired eyes, but holding something different now, something heavier. Downstairs, the kitchen was unchanged, but it didn't feel the same. The 4 flash drives were still sitting on the counter, where I'd left them. Their presence was sharp, almost louder than any words could be. My husband noticed them the moment he walked in, just like he had the night before. He didn't pick one up this time. He didn't tap it with his thumb or turn it over in his hand. He simply looked at them, then at me, and then went on making his coffee. That look stayed with me all morning. I cleaned the counters twice, even though they were already clean. I straightened the chairs, folded the dish towels, rearranged the spice jars in the cupboard just to keep my hands moving. But none of it took away the tightness in my chest. My friend called again in the afternoon. Her voice filled the kitchen, light and warm as always. She wanted to know how her son was adjusting, whether he was eating well, whether he seemed happy. I answered her questions with words that felt thin and fragile coming out of my mouth. He's fine, I told her, because what else could I say? When I hung up, I turned to find my husband leaning against the doorway, his arms crossed loosely. He didn't say a word. He just watched me set the phone down. The rest of the day unfolded slowly, like a film strip dragging across the projector. I moved through the motions, chopping vegetables, loading the dishwasher, folding laundry, but every movement felt deliberate, every sound measured. That evening, the tension in the house felt almost physical. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier, the silences longer. My husband sat at the table, scrolling through his phone with one hand, the other resting on the counter near the flash drives. He didn't touch them, didn't mention them, but the proximity itself felt like a statement. I made tea, the clinking of the spoon against the cup far too loud in the stillness. I carried the cup to the table and set it down. He looked at me. It wasn't an angry look, or even an accusatory one. It was calm. Too calm. That calmness was harder to bear than any outburst could have been. After dinner, I found myself alone in the kitchen. The dishes were done, the lights dim, the clock ticking too loudly on the wall. I stood by the counter, staring at the flash drives. 4 of them. Small, silent, lined up like questions waiting for answers. I opened the drawer, the one where the first flash drive had lived for days, and stared at the empty space where it had sat before I'd taken it out. I could have picked one up. I could have slid it into my laptop, seen whatever it had to show me, faced whatever truth it held. But I didn't. I left them all there, lined up on the counter, untouched. Later that night, I found myself in the kitchen again. The house was dark, quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you can hear your own heartbeat. The clock on the wall read 1:43. The same hour as always. But this time, the kitchen was empty. No kettle humming, no soft voice, no presence waiting at the table. Just me. I sat down, my hands flat against the table, staring at the flash drives, at the unopened envelope that had arrived last, at the stillness of the room. The tea I'd made went cold in its cup. The lamplight buzzed faintly overhead. The house felt both too large and too small at once. I reached for the nearest flash drive. I held it in my hand, feeling the lightness of it, the smooth surface, the sharp edges. My laptop sat just a few feet away. I could open it. I could know. I could let the answers spill out and change everything in one motion. But I didn't. I sat there, holding it, staring at the black plastic, my breath shallow, my heartbeat loud enough that it felt like it filled the room. Then I set it back down. I didn't plug it in. I didn't throw it away either. I just left it there on the counter, the line of flash drives unbroken, the envelope unopened, the kitchen clock still ticking away seconds I couldn't reclaim. I looked around the kitchen one last time, the same kitchen where everything had begun, the mugs, the soft lights, the quiet hours. Everything looked the same. Nothing felt the same. And as I sat there, my hands resting on the table, the cold tea untouched in front of me, I understood one thing with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Whatever I chose to do next, nothing in this house, nothing in my life, would ever go back to what it was before.